Hey, history lovers! Welcome back to the channel. Today, we're tackling one of the biggest questions in all of human history. A question that's been debated for literally 1500 years. Why did Rome fall? Not just fall, but collapse so completely that Europe plunged into centuries of chaos. So settle in, because we're about to uncover what actually brought down the greatest empire the ancient world had ever seen. Most people think Rome fell because of barbarian invasions. It's the story we learned in school. Germanic tribes swarmed across the borders, sacked the city in 410 CE, and that was it. Empire over. The barbarians at the gates narrative is clean, simple, and dramatic. But when you actually look at the historical evidence, the primary sources, the archaeological record, the economic data, that explanation doesn't hold up. Rome didn't fall in a day. It didn't even fall in a century. The Western Roman Empire took nearly 200 years to fully collapse, and the eastern half, what we call the Byzantine Empire, survived another 1,000 years. In this video, I'm going to argue that Rome didn't fall because of external enemies. It fell because of internal contradictions that had been building for centuries. And I believe the barbarian invasions were just the final symptom of a disease that started at the very height of Roman power. To understand this, we need to establish what we actually know from the historical record. The traditional date given for the fall of Rome is 476 CE. That's when the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer. But here's what the sources tell us was already happening long before that moment. First, the crisis of the 3rd century, from 235 to 284 CE, Rome had 50 different emperors in just 50 years. Most were assassinated by their own troops. The historian Herodian, who lived through this period, describes the empire as being torn apart by civil wars, with armies constantly fighting each other instead of defending the borders. Second, the Plague of Cyprian devastated the empire from 249 to 262 CE. Saint Cyprian, the Bishop of Carthage, wrote eyewitness accounts describing 5,000 people dying per day in Rome alone. Modern scholars estimate this plague killed between 20 and 30% of the entire Roman population. That's catastrophic population loss. Third, the economic collapse was documented in the currency itself. Under Emperor Nero in 60 CE, Roman silver coins were 94% pure silver. By 260 CE, just 200 years later, the coins were only 5% silver. The government had debased the currency so badly that inflation destroyed people's savings and trust in the monetary system. Fourth, the archaeological evidence shows massive urban decline starting in the 3rd century. Cities across the Western Empire show signs of abandonment. Defensive walls being built hastily around shrunken city centers, and the breakdown of long-distance trade networks. This isn't speculation. It's in the ruins. And here's the crucial timeline detail most people miss. Emperor Diocletian fundamentally restructured the empire in 284 CE, splitting it into eastern and western halves with separate administrations. This was an admission that the empire had become too large and complex to govern as a single unit. Rome was already breaking apart from within before any major barbarian invasions occurred. Here's where I think the traditional barbarian invasion narrative completely falls apart. If Rome was this unstoppable military superpower, why did it suddenly become vulnerable to tribes it had been defeating for centuries? Let me walk you through the problems with the simple invasion theory. First, the Germanic tribes weren't new enemies. Rome had been fighting Germanic peoples since Julius Caesar conquered Gaul in the 1st century BCE. For hundreds of years, Roman legions regularly defeated these tribes. What changed wasn't that the barbarians suddenly got stronger, It's that Rome got weaker. Second, many of these so-called barbarian invasions were actually refugees seeking asylum. The Visigoths, who sacked Rome in 410 CE, had been living inside the empire as foederati-allied peoples for decades. They turned hostile after Roman officials betrayed and massacred their leaders at a peace conference. The historian Ammianus Marcellinus documents this treachery in detail. Third, the empire's military was no longer Roman. By the 4th century CE, the majority of soldiers in the Roman legions were themselves Germanic recruits. The historian Vegetes wrote around 390 CE that the legions had abandoned traditional training and discipline. The very army that was supposed to defend Rome had become indistinguishable from the peoples invading it. I personally believe the real answer lies in what historians call the military-fiscal spiral. Here's how it worked. Rome needed massive armies to defend its enormous borders. Maintaining those armies required crushing taxation. But heavy taxation destroyed the economic productivity of the provinces. Declining productivity meant less tax revenue. Less revenue meant the government couldn't pay soldiers. Unpaid soldiers mutinied or turned to banditry, which required more military spending. This is documented in the Theodosian Code, a collection of Roman laws from the 4th and 5th centuries. The laws show increasingly desperate attempts to bind peasants to the land, force sons to take their fathers' occupations, and prevent tax collectors from being murdered by the people they were taxing. This is not a healthy society. This is a system eating itself. Here's my theory. Rome fell because it never solved the fundamental problem of succession. Unlike monarchies with clear hereditary rules, Rome never established a legitimate, stable way to transfer power. From Augustus onward, emperors were made by military force. Whoever controlled the legions controlled the throne. This created a catastrophic incentive structure. Ambitious generals had every reason to march on Rome and seize power, and loyal governors had every reason to rebel if they thought they were about to be purged. The result was endless civil war, which drained resources, destroyed armies in fratricidal combat, and made long-term planning impossible. This actually reminds me of what happened to other great empires throughout history. The pattern is remarkably consistent. The Han dynasty in China collapsed around the same time as Rome, 3rd century CE, for strikingly similar reasons. Endless civil wars, loss of central authority, economic crisis, and fragmenting into competing kingdoms. When I researched this, I realized this parallels what happened to the Abbasid Caliphate in the medieval period. As the central government weakened, provincial governors became independent warlords. The empire existed in name only, while real power fragmented into dozens of competing states. The common thread is this: large pre-modern empires faced an impossible challenge. They needed strong militaries to defend their borders, but strong militaries were also the primary threat to internal stability. Any general with enough troops to defeat external enemies also had enough troops to overthrow the emperor. Rome never solved this paradox. Now let's play this out. What would have happened if Rome had developed a stable succession system, something like primogeniture, where the eldest son automatically inherits? If emperors knew their sons would inherit peacefully, they'd invest in long-term improvements rather than short-term survival. If generals knew they couldn't seize the throne by force, they'd stop waging civil wars. The military could focus entirely on external defense. Imagine if the crisis of the 3rd century never happened. Those 50 years of civil war devastated the empire's economy, killed hundreds of thousands of soldiers in pointless battles against other Roman armies, and invited external invasions from peoples who saw the empire tearing itself apart. Without that crisis, Rome might have maintained its economic strength. its currency wouldn't have collapsed, and the plague might not have been so devastating, because functioning trade networks and government administration help societies respond to disease. But here's the deeper counterfactual. If Rome had survived, would we have had the Renaissance, the medieval period? The entire development of European feudalism arose from Rome's collapse. The Catholic Church filled the power vacuum left by Roman government. Modern European nations formed from the fragments of Roman provinces. So, in a strange way, Rome's fall created the world we live in. The political decentralization of medieval Europe, hundreds of competing kingdoms and city-states, may have fostered the competition and innovation that eventually led to modern science, democracy, and industrialization. China and the Islamic world had stronger centralized empires, and some historians argue this actually slowed their development compared to fragmented, competitive Europe. This suggests that Rome's failure to solve its succession crisis didn't just doom the empire. It fundamentally shaped the next 1500 years of human history. Here's what we know for certain from the sources. Rome didn't fall because barbarians were strong. It fell because Rome was weak. And Rome was weak because it never solved the internal contradictions of its own power structure. The empire required military strength to survive, but military strength constantly threatened to tear it apart from within. It needed tax revenue to fund armies, but heavy taxation destroyed the economy that generated revenue. It needed stable leadership to plan for the future, but the system of military succession guaranteed instability and civil war. The barbarian invasions of the 5th century were the final blow to a structure that had been crumbling for 200 years. The sack of Rome in 410 CE was shocking, but the empire that was sacked was already a shadow of what it had been in the 2nd century. So, essentially, I believe Rome fell because it never evolved beyond the military autocracy established by Augustus. The system worked brilliantly when you had competent emperors like Marcus Aurelius or Trajan. But it failed catastrophically when succession became contested, because there was no legitimate process, only force. This reveals something profound about political systems. They need more than military power and economic resources to survive. They need legitimate, predictable mechanisms for transferring power. Without that, even the greatest empire in history will eventually consume itself. But I know this is debatable. Do you think Rome's fall was inevitable given its political structure, or could different leadership have saved it? Was the collapse caused by internal contradictions, or were external pressures the real killer? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into why the greatest empire in ancient history came crashing down, hit that like button and subscribe for more historical analysis. Until next time, remember, even Rome wasn't built to last forever. Thanks for watching.